The New Year Honours 1971 were appointments in many of the Commonwealth realms of Queen Elizabeth II to various orders and honours to reward and highlight good works by citizens of those countries. They were announced in supplements to the London Gazette of 31 December 1970 to celebrate the year past and mark the beginning of 1971. At this time, honours for Australians were awarded both in the United Kingdom honours on the advice of the premiers of Australian states, and also in a separate Australia honours list. Recipients of honours are displayed here as they were styled before the new honours. United Kingdom. Life Peer Baron Sir Charles Hector Fitzroy Maclean, BTK. TK.BE, Chief Scout of the Commonwealth. The Right Honourable Sir Jocelyn Edward Salis Simon, President of the Probate, Divorce and Admiralty Division of the High Court of Justice. Sir Miles Webster Thomas, D.F.C., President and lately Chairman, National Savings Committee. Privy Councillor the Honourable Sir Cyril Ambrose Walsh, K.B.E.A. Justice of the High Court of Australia. Knight Bachelor William Melville Arnott TD.F.R.C. P.Ed. William Withering Professor of Medicine, University of Birmingham. Morris Alfred List to Banks, for services to patent law. David Haven Baron, Chairman, Shell Transport and Trading Company Limited. Raymond Percival Brooks, Chairman and Chief Executive. Guest Keener Nettlefolds Limited, for services to export. Leslie Cannon, C.B.E., General President, Electronic and Telecommunications Union. Henry Frederick Ross Cathwood, Director General, National Economic Development Office. Henry Chisholm, C.B.E., Chairman, Corby Development Corporation. Alan Howard Cottle, Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor to the Government. Cyril Thomas Cripps, M.B.E. for Public and Charitable Services. Professor Frederick Sidney Dainton, for services to science and higher education. George Edward Raven Deacon, C.B.E. Director, National Institute of Oceanography. Gerald Alfred Glover, for political and public services. Francis Frederick Griffin Alderman, Birmingham City Council. Adrian Lincoln Hallinan, D.L., for local government and public services in Cardiff. John Wyndham Pope Hennessy, C.B.E. for services to fine art. William Aylsham Brian Hopkin, C.B.E. Deputy Chief Economic Advisor, H.M. Treasury. Cyril Hugh Kleinwert, Chairman, Committee on Invisible Exports. Donald Ross Liddell, D.L., Lord Provost of the City of Glasgow. Wiley McIsaac, O.B.E.M.S.F., RCS, Neurological Surgeon. Henry Stenhouse Mance, Chairman of Lloyd's. Frank Shaw Marshall Alderman, Leeds City Council. Stirrat Andrew William Johnson Marshall, C.B.E. Senior Partner. Robert Matthew Johnson Marshall and Partners. Douglas Osmond, C.B.E. Q.P.M. Chief Constable, Hampshire Constabulary. Dennis Lionel Page, Regius Professor of Greek, University of Cambridge. The Right Honourable Robert Wilson Porter, QC MP Minister of Home Affairs, Government of Northern Ireland 1969-70. Humphrey Povich Reverbian Prideaux, O.B.E. Chairman, Navy, Army and Air Force Institutes. William Clark Ramsey, C.B.E. for services to rugby football. Alexander Ross, lately Chairman, East European Trade Council, for services to export. The Honourable Marcus Joseph CFO, B.E. Joint Managing Director, Marks & Spencer Limited, for services to export. William Gordon Bryce, C.B.E. QC, Chief Justice, Bahama Islands. The Honourable Mr. Justice William Algernon Holwell Duffus, President, Court of Appeal for East Africa. The Honourable Kenneth Fung Ping Fan, C.B.E. for Public and Social Services in Hong Kong. Rupert Godfrey John, Governor of St. Vincent. Australian states. State of New South Wales. The Honourable Asher Alexander Joel O.B.E. for services to the community. Matthew John O'Neill C.B.E. for services to commerce and charity. Raymond Edgar Purvis C.B.E. for services to the community. State of Victoria. Charles Roger Darvall C.B.E. of Toorak for public service. Professor Sidney Lance Townsend V.R.D. M.D. F.R.C.S. of Hawthorne East. Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology, University of Melbourne. State of Queensland. The Honourable Harold Richter of Brisbane for outstanding public services. State of Western Australia. Norman Brearley C.B.E.D. SOMCA FC for services to aviation. Reginald Fielding Rushton of Perth for outstanding service to the community. State of Tasmania. The Honourable Alfred John White, Agent General for Tasmania in London. Order of the Bath. Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. Admiral Sir Michael Patrick Pollock K.C.B.M. V.O.D. SC General Sir Desmond Fitzpatrick K.C.B.D. S.O.M. B.E.M.C.A. D.C. Late Royal Armoured Corps Deputy Colonel The Blues and Rolls. Air Chief Marshal Sir Dennis Spotswood K.C.B.C. B.E.D. S.O.D. F.C.A. D.C. Royal Air Force. Sir George Edward Godber K.C.B.D.M.F. R.C.P. Chief Medical Officer, Department of Health and Social Security, Department of Education and Science and Home Office. Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. Admiral Edward Beckworth Ashmore C.B.D. S.C. Vice Admiral Andrew Mackenzie Lewis C.B. Lieutenant General William Godfrey Fothergill Jackson O.B.E.M.C. Late Corps of Royal Engineers. Lieutenant General Richard Erskine Ward C.B.D. S.O.M.C. Late Royal Armoured Corps Colonel Commandant Royal Tank Regiment. Air Marshal William Derrick Hodgkinson C.B.C. B.E.D. F.C.A. F.C. Royal Air Force. Air Marshal Harold Brownlow Martin C.B.D. S.O.D. F.C.A. F.C. Royal Air Force. William Dennis Pyle C.B.M. B.E. Permanent Under Secretary of State, Department of Education and Science. Companion of the Order of the Bath. Military Division. Rear Admiral Charles Courtney Anderson. Rear Admiral Derek George Kent. Rear Admiral Nigel Hugh Mallim M.V. Rear Admiral Douglas Granger Parker D. S.O.D. S.C.A. F.C. Major General Dennis Arthur Beckett D. S.O.O. B.E. Late Infantry. Major General John Kane Cowley, Royal Army Pay Corps. Brigadier Barbara Masson Gordon R.C.Q. H.N.S. Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps. Major General Frank Douglas King M.B.E. Late Infantry. Major General David Lanyon Lloyd Owen D. S.O.O. B.E.M.C. Late Infantry. Major General Alexander Young, Late Royal Army Ordnance Corps. Air Vice Marshal Neil Cameron C.B.E.D. S.O.D. F.C. Royal Air Force. Air Vice Marshal Nigel Martin Maynard C.B.E.D. F.C.A. F.C. Royal Air Force. Air Vice Marshal Leslie Howard Moulton D. F.C. Royal Air Force. Air Commodore Charles Duncan Alfred Brown D. F.C. Royal Air Force. Civil Division. Frederick John Atkinson, Chief Economic Advisor, Department of Trade and Industry. Clifford Henry Bayliss, Controller, H.M. Stationery Office. Basil Edmund Bellamy, Under Secretary, Department of Trade and Industry. Norman Coles, Deputy Chief Advisor, Ministry of Defense. Peter Richmond Cox, Deputy Government Actuary. Herbert Clyde Fitzer B.E. Director of Engineering and Head of the Royal Naval Engineering Service, Ministry of Defence. Leonard Ralph Fletcher, Secretary, University Grants Committee. Thomas Charles Green, Chief Charity Commissioner. Eric William Charles Lewis, Controller of Death Duties, Board of Inland Revenue. Miss Jean Josephine Nunn, C.B.E., lately Deputy Secretary, Cabinet Office. John Glendo Owen, Under-Secretary, H.M. Treasury. Ronald Walter Radford, M.B.E., Deputy Chairman, Board of Customs and Excise. Humbogis Rolf, C.B.E., Deputy Clerk of the Crown in Chancery and Deputy Permanent Secretary to the Lord Chancellor. Peter Eustace Thornton, Deputy Secretary, Cabinet Office. Henry Gabriel Ware, Deputy Treasury Solicitor. Henry Yellowlees, M.R.C.P., M.R.C.S., Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Department of Health and Social Security. Order of St. Michael and St. George, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. Sir Charles Hepburn Johnston, K.C.M.G., British High Commissioner, Canberra. Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. Peter Telford Hayman, C.M.G., C.V.O.M., B.E., British High Commissioner, Ottawa. Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. Arthur Hugh Bunting, Professor of Agricultural Botany, University of Reading, for services to developing countries. James Richard Cross, lately Senior British Trade Commissioner, Montreal. Stanley Mason Davies, Assistant Secretary, Department of Health and Social Security. John Ivan McKinnon Rhodes, Minister, United Kingdom Mission to the United Nations. Lillian Catherine, Mrs. Somerville, O.B.E., Director, Fine Arts Department, British Council. Miss Gillian Gerda Brown, Councillor and Head of Chancery, H.M. Embassy, Bern. John Christopher Window Bushell, Minister and Deputy Commandant, British Military Government, Berlin. Ronald Laurie Huckstep, M.D., F.R.C.S., Honorary Surgeon in Charge, Round Table Polio Clinic, Kampala. Kenneth James Knaggs, O.B.E., formerly Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Defence, Zambia. Miss Daphne Margaret Sybil Desiree Park, H.M. Consul General, Hanoi. James Grant Purvis, H.M. Consul General 1, Hamburg. Alistair Todd, Defence Secretary, Hong Kong. John Peter Tripp, H.M. Ambassador, Tripoli. Australian State of New South Wales. Charles Aubrey Hardwick Q.C. for service to the community. State of Victoria. Alan John Moyer of Toorak, for services to horse racing. State of South Australia. Colin Sandergrove Ballantyne of Adelaide, for services to the theatre. State of Western Australia. Kenneth Joseph Townsing, I.S.O. Under-Treasurer for Western Australia, for outstanding public service to the community and to education. State of Tasmania. Robert Charles Sharp, Director of Public Works, State of Tasmania. Royal Victorian Order. Dame Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Lady Margaret Catherine Hay, C.V.O. Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order the Very Reverend Robert Wilmer Woods. Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Lady Susan Catherine Hussey. Dennis Hay Marion, Ph.D. George Gayspace. Paul Edward Paget. John Pillow, M.V.O., Member of the Royal Victorian Order. At this time the two lowest classes of the Royal Victorian Order were Member and Member, both with post-nominal letters. M.V.O. Member was renamed Lieutenant from the 1985 New Year Honours onwards. Fourth Class Major Ralph Sidney Bromhead. Douglas Walter Butt, M.V.O. John Robert Hare. Lieutenant Colonel John Frederick Dame Johnston, M.C. Captain Norman Henry Morgan, M.V.O. M.M. Surgeon Commander John Roger Lawrence Owen, M.B.E. Royal Navy. Squadron Leader Anthony William Picking, Royal Air Force. Squadron Leader Philip George Pinney, Royal Air Force. Wing Commander Michael John Rayson, Royal Air Force. Brian Barrington Dashwood Stopford. Miss Jean Elizabeth Taylor, M.V.O. Derek Roy Waters, M.V.O. Robert William Way. 5th Class Miss Clarice Winifred Austin. John David Gallagher. Miss Edith Holmes. Harry Dockrell Jones. Captain Lewis Thomas Lambert, Royal Marines. Squadron Leader James Marshall, Royal Air Force. Miss Florence Wade. Royal Victorian Medal Flight Sergeant Peter James Bourne, Royal Air Force. Yeoman Bedgoer John Baxter, Her Majesty's Bodyguard of the Yeoman of the Guard. Miss Gladys Bell. Albert Victor Charlwood. Corporal David Arthur Evans, Royal Air Force. Chief Petty Officer Roger George Eves. Lily, Mrs. Foster. Robert William Fryer. Edward Victor Lovegrove. Robert Geddes MacDonald. Police Constable Ralph Alec Lewis Morton, Metropolitan Police. Miss Robertina Nicol. Joseph Matthew Pierce. Chief Engineering Mechanic David John Rayworth. Joseph Smith. Miss Gwendolyn May Suckling. John Eric Taylor. Walter Vickers. Arthur Vincent. Flight Sergeant Frank Stanhope Williams B.E.M. Royal Air Force. Order of the British Empire Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire Sir Henry Alexander Benson, C.B.E. Senior Partner, Cooper Brothers and Company, Chartered Accountants. For Public Services. Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire Adelaide Bale U. Mrs. Doughty, C.B.E. For Political Services in the South East. Agatha Mary Clarissa Lady Malone, C.B.E. Author. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire Major General John Evelyn Anderson, C.B.E. Late Royal Corps of Signals, Colonel Commandant Royal Corps of Signals. Acting Air Marshal John Hunter Todd, C.B.O. B.E. Royal Air Force. Sir Herbert Archbold Brecon, C.B.E. Chairman, Main Organising Committee, 1970 Commonwealth Games. Roger Talbot Walters, C.B.E. Controller General, Department of the Environment. Colonel Sir Arthur Edwin Young, C.M.G., C.V.O.K., P.M. Lately Chief Constable, Royal Ulster Constabulary. The Right Honourable Richard Duke Baron Coleridge, C.B.E. Lately Executive Secretary to North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, Brussels. Order of the Companions of Honour Sir Maurice Bowra, for services to literature. New Zealand. Knight Bachelor Noel Cole, of Auckland. For outstanding services to the community. Order of the Bath. Companion of the Order of the Bath Military Division Rear Admiral Lawrence George Carr DSC, Royal New Zealand Navy. Order of St. Michael and St. George. Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Kendrick G. Archer, of Christchurch, for most valuable services as a judge of the Valuation Court and chairman of various administrative tribunals. Ivan Thomas, of Wellington, for most valuable services as General Manager of the New Zealand Railways. Order of the British Empire. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Brian Gerald Barrett Boys CBEM for outstanding services as Surgeon in charge of the Cardiothoracic Unit at Green Lane Hospital, Auckland. George Philip Proctor CBE, of Wellington, for outstanding services to manufacturing and the community. Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Professor Ian Alistair Gordon, of Wellington, for very valuable services to university education. James Robert Madron, of Christchurch, for very valuable services to industry and the export drive. Professor John Arthur Reginald Miles MD, of Dunedin, for very valuable services to science. Alec Lindsay Poole of Wellington, for very valuable services to the development of forestry and the forest industries. Military Division Brigadier Ian Thomas Galloway OBE Ed. Royal New Zealand Armoured Corps. Officer of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Miss Marjorie French-Anne Adams of Auckland, for valuable services to education as headmistress of Epsom Girls' Grammar School from 1953 to 1970. The Right Reverend Owen Thomas Baragwanath Ed. of Auckland, for valuable services to the community as a minister of religion. Robert Colville Bradshaw of Upper Hutt, for valuable services to industry and commerce. The Reverend Haddon Charles Dixon of Lower Hutt, for valuable services to the relief of hunger and poverty overseas. John Lloyd Finaughty of Wellington, for valuable services as New Zealand Commissioner-General at Expo 70 Osaka. Claude Jack Ferrier of Christchurch, for valuable services to the community. Miss Marie-Louise Dancy Isles MBE of Christchurch, for valuable services as General Secretary of the Girl Guides Association. Gilbert McLean MBCHB, for valuable services to the community as Chairman of the Wellington Hospital Board. Russell Matthews of New Plymouth, for valuable services to the community. John Alexander Moreland of Cambridge, for valuable services to the dairy industry. Mrs. Iriaka Rio Tehahiri Ratana of Whangaehu, for valuable services to the Maori people. Mrs. Constance Egmont Tulloch MBE of Putaruru, for valuable services to the community, especially as Chairman of the Waikato Hospital Board. Edward William Desmond Unwin MBE Ed. for valuable services as Chairman of the Timaru Harbour Board. Military Division Commander Raymond Frederick Sanderson VRD, Royal New Zealand Naval Volunteer Reserve. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Wynne Beasley, Royal New Zealand Army Medical Corps. Group Captain Nelson Hastings Bright, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Member of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Lloyd James Appleton of Danavaka, for services to local government and journalism. Thomas Frank Armstrong Archer of Nelson, for services as President of the New Zealand Fruit Growers Federation Limited 1950 to 1966. Neil Alexander Barr of Kaukopakoppa, for services as founder of the Farm Forestry Association in New Zealand. Frederick Harold Bennett, for services to local government as chairman of the Masterton County Council. Percival Mayan Brooker of Wellington, for services to brass band music. Stanley Crawford Childs of Pukekohe, for services to local government. Mrs. Molly Christie MBCHB of Wanganui, for services to the community. Wilfred Trevor Church of Hamilton, for services to the community. Alan Harry de Costa of Gisborne, for services to surf life saving. Frank McGregor Henderson of Lumsden, for services to agriculture and education. Mrs. Lily Annie Huggan, for services to the community especially as Mayor of Petone. Mrs. Eileen Marie Kelly of Greymouth, for services to the community. Father Thomas Gerard Keys of Invercargill, for services to the rehabilitation of young offenders. Harold Edward Lawrence of Otorawanga, for services to local government. Charles Frederick Lecran of Christchurch, for services to amputees. Mrs. Jessie Kennedy Lees of New Plymouth, for services to the Women's Division of Federated Farmers. Mrs. Caroline Elizabeth Lepper of Invercargill, for services to crippled children. Louis Roland Lewis of Napier, for services to education. George Lorimer McClotchy of Oamaru, for services to the poultry industry. Colin Earl Meads of Te Kuiti, for services to rugby football. Walter Allen Parker, for services as Mayor of Kaitangata. Henry Whitton Bell Popplewell of Hastings, for services to the community. Gordon Cowie Riddle of Auckland, for services to the community. Brian Preston Stevenson of Auckland, for services to local government. Military Division Lieutenant Commander Ian George McLean, Royal New Zealand Naval Volunteer Reserve. Lieutenant Commander John Joseph Mayer, Royal New Zealand Navy. Warrant Officer 2nd Class David Ernie Dorset, Corps of Royal New Zealand Engineers. Warrant Officer 1st Class Roland Alfred Manning, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. Warrant Officer 1st Class George Hedley Newcomb, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. Warrant Officer William Twaddle Frickleton Buchanan MM, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Flight Lieutenant Walter George Carruthers, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Companion of the Imperial Service Order Ian Greville Watt of Auckland, for valuable services as Director of the Meat Division, Department of Agriculture. British Empire Medal Civil Division Ernest Ashton of Nelson, for services to the community especially as a member of the St John Ambulance Association. Mrs. Sheila Curry of Christchurch, for services to disabled and handicapped children. Mrs. Daphne Matilda Dobell of Kaitaia, for services to the community. Lee Sheris Gooch of Takopatsu, for services to the Scouting Movement. Mrs. Zella Eugenie Harrison of Hokitika, for services to the community. George Charles Hart of Auckland, for services to the community. Joseph Frederick Jobson of Linden, for services as a member of the Post Office. Mrs. Eileen Elizabeth Lane of Christchurch, for services to netball. Mrs. Marjorie Isabel Pilkington of Opotiki, for services to the community. Miss Agnes Reid of Auckland, for services to intellectually handicapped children. Constable Raymond John Ruane of Katikati, for services to the community. John Smith of Rotorua, for services as a tour coach driver. Mrs. Winifred Mary Smith of Ranfurly, for services to the community. Military Division Chief Marine Engineering Artificer Kelvin William Hunt, Royal New Zealand Navy. Petty Officer Lee George Morley, Royal New Zealand Navy. Staff Sergeant Wallace Richards, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. Staff Sergeant Daniel Wilfred Wilson, New Zealand Special Air Service. Flight Sergeant Wallace Frederick Cleaver, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Flight Sergeant Joseph John Keegan, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Temporary Sergeant Ronald Allen Nicholson, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Air Force Cross Lieutenant Commander Nigel Hawksley Burberry, Royal Navy. Squadron Leader Donald Raymond Smith, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Fire Service Medal Frank Albert Hardy, Chief Fire Officer, Christchurch Fire Brigade. Peter Habib, Fireman, Haumawana. Queen's Police Medal George Stewart Austing, Assistant Commissioner, New Zealand Police Force. Queen's Commendation for Valuable Service in the Air Flight Lieutenant John Stewart Hosey, Royal New Zealand Air Force.